This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I can't be protected by hopes and prayers.
I won't use hope towards what's next. I'll make my own way.
I know impossible is an opinion.
I won't wait for safer schools. I want to create them.
I don't want to be afraid anymore.
I refuse to be a victim.
I'm just one person.
Determined
To bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
To bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
So, Jonathan, I'd like to start with you here. So, I know you have always been proactive with your school safety initiatives and policies, given your background. But what are some of the factors in public perception if a district takes proactive school safety measures? Like, I've heard from some folks that if you're creating a question of is their school environment not safe, and what are some of those challenges being proactive?
So some of the challenges are not just within our own community or a particular school, but could be the environment beyond that school, your state system, what the state mandates are. There are, of course, federal mandates, which are much more consistent for all of us in this field. However, understanding what emanates, for school safety requirements, whether that's behavioral threat assessment, certain types of assessments that are required to be done, you'll find as we have this discussion across most of the panelists, there will be some common themes. The goal ultimately, at least speaking from a school board director's point of view, is are we curious enough? We don't have to be an expert about everything, but where are you getting the information that helps to set a consistent, common set of facts that are objective, independently verified? Because that's where we can start with common sense instead of the politics to put that public safety, school safety, and security at the forefront. So if you don't have that common ground and a bit of an understanding of your environment, then we're simply going to be debating in a circle because everyone's going to bring their own set of facts. So that's very important in building bridges.
So do we have, Jonathan, just follow up, do we have a common set of facts and data for reporting? Does that exist today?
Yes, probably more than I'm aware of. And many of the experts here, I think in the chat can maybe list some of the resources that they use so we can help each other. But we have had, going back many years, 2017, 19, there's another recent Secret Service study that's been put out. Going back to one of those original Department of Education Secret Service studies, that's where they focused on research, and that's the key. Understand what evidence-based means, and is it replicable? Has it also been evaluated by others? It's great if it's researchers as well, and that's where behavioral threat assessment is really important. People can throw around a lot of words, but to do that little bit of additional research comes back to the curiosity. Then we could look whether it's technology and systems that need to be implemented, other types of promising practices. A lot is out there. The COPS office of U.S. Department of Justice has a set of standards that they've created, and even an evaluation for an SRO program. We have other nonprofits nationwide as well, and I'll look forward to looking into the chat. But that's where really we don't have to know it all. I think that's probably the most important, is go into it knowing humbly that we don't have all the answers. That once again brings together community members, stakeholders from different perspectives to have more of a diversity of opinion to get to a clear vision of what works for each individual community, because it isn't cookie cutter, though there are some common denominators.
So Brandon, in your experience, I mean, you have your background in law enforcement and training, and as a school board director, I mean, where do you see the political landscape influencing the prioritization of school safety initiatives, training, technology? Where does that influence things?
So I think that's a great question. And I think it comes down to, knowledge, understanding, and gaining the knowledge for the information maybe that you don't know, Oftentimes we think about our role in different arenas, to Johnson's point, always having to have the answer. But sometimes you don't have to have the answer. You just have to know where to go get it. And so when you think about what does this really look like holistically, and some of it, quite frankly, is being comfortable or getting to the point of being comfortable to have the uncomfortable conversation, right? Where are we really? What's really happening? And let's identify those challenges and then get the right people in the room to lay out a plan to address those challenges and move forward. The reality is to some degree, we are always playing catch up, right? We're always playing catch up to the latest situation, the latest technology. And so we have to be able to understand the layers, and that there are many layers to school safety, and be willing to truly be honest with ourselves in organizational leadership to say, this is where we are, this is where we want to go, and this is how we get there, and lay out that path. And again, putting the right people in the room to help get you there. And so, surrounding yourself with folks who can get you navigate that path for your organization or your district.
Well, definitely, Scott, your thoughts on that?
We've said the word, or you've heard the word perspective a number of times already with just the first question. And there's been far too many school shootings, but there are many, many more schools that have not yet had one. And hopefully they won't, but I think the perspective, the feeling is that the likelihood is that they will. And my experience is a little bit more anecdotal than professional, but in 2015, I was the campaign manager for the Reynolds bond measure. And when the school district did the polling, it indicated a 68% likelihood of passage. When we talked about safety, specifically related to active shooters, it went to 72%. Part of that reason was that in the prior year, we did have a shooting at Reynolds High School, and a young man, Emilio Hoffman, lost his life. And so people's perspective changed. Safety became more important to them because it hit home. And things that we were going to do in the bond measure were to add a secure vestibule to all the schools in the district, to add an auto locking system where you could push a button and lock all the doors of the district, and then to remodel the high school because it was many buildings across campus that were separate and had multiple entrances and exits, and we put them all under one roof essentially, so that there were fewer ways in, fewer ways out, and fewer students and staff that were isolated in one corner of a campus and further away from help. But we only passed, so 68 and 72, we passed 52 to 48. And we were actually the first bond measure to pass in East Multnomah County. Prior to that, the last one to pass in East Multnomah County was in 2006. So we've gone 9 years with bond measures. They had failed. And we finally passed when safety was our emphasis, and we barely passed, just by 4%.
Perspectives, right, Scott? So Jonathan, so how do you combat the perspective that nothing will ever happen here? We have a very safe community. We're immune to the potential of violence in our school district. How do you counter that? How do you deal with that perspective?
You want to make sure that perspective, first and foremost, is in your leadership, right? From your board to your superintendent on down. There are going to be aspects of communities that have different opinions, right? Ultimately, any type of safety and security, there's an element of perception. But in leading with curiosity and really not having our heads in the sand about what's going on, and that's where you have to use the tools to get the right type of data that might not give you a perfect picture, but you can triangulate, so to speak. Are there climate surveys that are district-wide and community-wide, but you can also drill down and conduct the proper type of analysis? What type of measures or what type of accountability is there ultimately with your school board and the administration? Is there a regularly scheduled Safe Schools Committee? If not, well, that's one more opportunity, one, to have conduct oversight and something a board should be doing, but two, it's robbing a community of the opportunity to learn and add to the discussion. Whether it's the student representatives that may sit on that Safe Schools Committee, or the community members who, no matter how small or large, when it comes down to safe schools, it takes everyone to see something, say something. And you want to provide as many opportunities, raise as many antenna or receptors as possible to get that information and process it. That way, you can not only promote a culture of safety, but you're open to criticism, because if anything, school safety and security it's a perpetual process of improvement. And so if you don't have that discussion and you're not informing it and providing the opportunities, those who want to have their heads in the sand will continue to. And you hope that through that community dialogue, you can elevate, as I mentioned before, some commonalities, some things that people agree upon, and then you can work on better solutions.
So that's interesting. You mentioned, see something, say something. Over 10 years ago, OmniAlert launched a text-to-tip service, which was branded Bully Buster. The idea was to prevent, use psychology and technology to, minimize incidents of bullying. And what we heard from a number of schools is that because it involved like hanging posters, hey, basically, see something, say something. But we heard from schools was that it gave the perception that this was an unsafe environment. Do we really have a bullying problem? Is that something that we wanted? Parents were concerned about that. Like what's happening with our school? Is there a bullying issue here? Because the school is being proactive with that. Brandon, do you think has that dynamic changed? Do you think that school systems are looking from a more proactive perspective, or are they still looking from a reactive mode where we don't want to create, if we implement new security measures, if we implement training, right? If we implement Alice training, does that mean there's something wrong with our school?
I think, quite frankly, it's probably 50-50. I believe that there are, I shouldn't say I believe, I know for a fact that there are organizations and organizational leaders who still bury their head in the sand and say things like, well, we don't want to talk about that because, if we don't talk about it, it won't happen, right? I don't want to speak that into existence. And then there are others who are leading and not worried about the optics, right? What does it look like? I think also, some of those who lead, will respond to that with, well, I want to make sure, right? I don't just want to hope. I want to make sure that we are putting our students in safe buildings, in safe conditions that make it conducive to learning. And so I think there's definitely still those that believe that if we don't talk about it, if we don't bring it up, it won't happen. And there are those who are not worried about the optics, but changing and controlling the narrative to say, we're going to do these things to make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can to provide a safe environment that's conducive for learning. And those that are leading from that standpoint, I think you can see are very proactive in how their students and their faculty feel when they come to school, right? If you ask them, they're like, yeah, I feel safe, right? Whether it's from, hall monitors, security officers, school police officers, SROs, PBIS, MTSS, behavioral threat assessment programs, STAT programs, mentorship programs. I mean, those that are doing everything possible to make sure they're providing that environment. I think it reflects in the not only the student body, but also in the community, that parents feel safe when their student, their son or daughter, gets on a bus or they drop them off at school. There's a confidence in knowing an assurance that the school district has done and is doing everything possible to make sure that child is safe while in school.
On that note, Scott, so as a former mayor How? Let me just. Of course, my phone rings right here. So how can communities and schools collaborate with political leaders to foster shared responsibility for school safety? In your experience, was there much collaboration with your municipality and your school district?
Well, the participation exists. It wasn't a lot around necessarily safety in terms of threats of mass violence events, but just student safety, like where to put bus stops and things like that. We would work with transportation people so that students weren't crossing 4-lane roads like that and things like that. But we also just wanted to be positive. So my city, when I was mayor, we started the Wood Village Opportunity Scholarship. So Wood Village is one of 5 cities that are inside the Reynolds School District. And so, we started a scholarship for Wood Village grads. As when I was mayor, I participated for 3 biennia on the school's budget committee because I wanted to know what their budget limitations were and where they needed to spend money that, had restrictions and how that had to be spent. I think it's important that everyone realizes about schools is that it's not just a pot of money to educate your students. Federal dollars, for instance, have to be spent on specific things like nutrition or on students with learning plans. And so I think it's important that people know where the money came from. So I did that. And then I also served as the board chair for the Reynolds Education Foundation. So the district has a 501c3 that helped teachers get money for their classroom. We all know that teachers spend, significant amount. I've read on average of about $500 a year of their own money on their classroom. And so we did fundraising for grants to get dollars into classrooms so that they could spend less money. And I think that even if you're not a specific partner on safety now, if they want to partner on safety and you have a positive partnership with them on other elements, then they may invite you in. For instance, I was asked to testify at a recent school board meeting on SROs, or they're actually our deputy sheriffs, the Multnomah County deputy sheriffs that were being hired, so they call them SRDs. And I was in favor of it, but particularly because as an elected, I got a view into the culture of the different law enforcement agencies in the area. And quite frankly, had it not been the MCSO, the Multnomah County Sheriff that they were hiring, I might have been against it, because other agencies had past performance issues where, SROs were involved in school government, or students of color were disproportionately, encountered the SRO. But I knew that the Multnomah County Sheriff wouldn't necessarily treat students that way. And so I was very much in favor of having them there, particularly since our high school is right next door to a public park and there's no fence in between. And there have been shootings at the school. There have also been shootings in the public park. And so just having a police officer there all the time, I thought was vital.
Jonathan, what are you doing in North Penn School District regarding collaboration with political leaders and the school district, and how do you build trust, effective communications, and collaborations with those groups?
I think each school board director has their own opinion, right? Though as a board, at least in Pennsylvania, you all act as one. You need all 9 members, however a vote may go, and that's the voice of the board, right? Legislatively speaking. But for us, we find it important. I really want to not just serve my community here in southeastern Pennsylvania, but what can we do to educate our local state representatives? And even now, after I'm in my 5th or 6th year, we have good relationships even with our federal representatives, our Congress persons and senators, so that, right, they're not going to pick up the phone immediately. Why would they? But over the course of years and making an effort with all of your representatives, we know exactly who our collective legislative representatives are, and we educate them, whether it's through emails, whether it's the superintendent who has his own channel and will meet to keep those relationships going. It's that intergovernmental experience which we're not being political. And this is where it gets interesting. I'm accused of being political every day. I consider it advocacy, whether it's school funding, which in Pennsylvania has been ruled to be vastly inequitable. So that has an effect that ultimately trickles all the way down to school safety issues. Because if you're not getting your fair amount of funding for school safety, just maybe for infrastructure, but think about then the type of programming, the counselors, the layered approach that goes beyond just having boots on the ground and wires in the ceiling. That's where I feel, in my opinion, as a school board director, you have to make that outreach and make it happen. And then what are you doing as a conduit to make sure that community members are aware of what is being done in your state capital, what is being done in Washington, D.C.? We've added an agenda item over the last few years at all of our action meetings. There's a specific update on legislation that directly is going to impact our local community. When the buck gets passed from the State House to a taxpayer's door, we want a taxpayer to know about that. And when it comes to school safety, we have no problem, explaining what that means as a variable in the overall formula for our total spend. So I can go on for a while. I think we're still working a lot of it out. Ultimately, it comes down to being curious. And once again, building bridges. It doesn't matter what letter is behind your representative's name in their office. Meet with them. Every single person I've ever met with cares about school safety, and that's where you can begin and leave the politics behind.
Definitely. Scott, your thoughts?
Well, and Jonathan said a couple of things, conduit, and then also that, they might not pick up your call right away, but they always do return. And I think that, maybe the difference between a mayor and sometimes a school board is the power to convene. And so, make a partnership with your mayor, because, people do pick up the phone and they do show up when they're invited. That was one of the hardest things to learn about being mayor. I mean, look at me. If I call you on the phone and tell you to be here somewhere as Scott Harden, okay. But, when I was able to call as mayor, they came. And so that's it goes two ways. And so if you're school board and you don't have a relationship with your city government, then you don't have to rely on your city government to activate it. You can activate it, and then you can use that ability to convene that the mayor has.
No, that's great. And Scott and Jonathan, you both touch upon something that I think is very important, fundamental, is that, yes, everyone prioritizes school safety. Everyone says school safety is our top priority. But I can't tell you how many times that we've been contacted here with ZeroNow from parents that reach out to us and say, hey, what do we do? How do we make our school safer? I'm afraid to send my kids to school. Brandon, what advice would you give to a parent that has concerns about the safety of their school? And what advice would you give to elected officials, school board members, on the first steps, or superintendents? What are the first steps that you can take to secure your school, provide a more safer environment? What would you recommend?
Sure. I think the first part is the communication, right? The folks need to hear, whether it's what they want to hear or not. It's really about what they need to hear. And so sometimes, depending upon the layout of your community, you may have to take a unconventional route, right? I say this all the time. In most schools, you ask the question, who are the most important people? And you'll get answers like the teachers, the superintendents, the building principal, all that kind of stuff. But really, it's the kids, right? What do the kids have to say, right? What the kids that are in the building with the staff, with the teachers, every single day, what do they have to say? How do they feel, right? So let's hear from them, right? And tell us some of the things that maybe we thought we knew, or maybe we kind of gloss over. The other component is be constant, right? Be continual. Continue to have the conversation, whether it's in passing, what's a scheduled meeting, right? Continue to have the conversation, even though sometimes you feel like, well, I wasn't heard, or, they just blew me off. Come back to that conversation at every opportunity you get. And it may be a long period of time, right? It may be 6 months, it may be a year, it may be 2 years, but being consistent and soliciting those who are of like mind, right, to have the conversation in the circles they're having conversations in, and ultimately that all will start to filter its way back, to the board members, to the superintendents, to the CEO, to the president, whatever the title of the executive leader is, and it's coming from multiple places, right? And really, it's sometimes we confuse passion for anger, and people who are passionate about this, it's really because it's something they believe in, and they nobody wants to send their kid to a school where they question whether or not their child is safe there, and so we just have to continue to have the conversation, be upfront, be matter of fact about it, be honest with ourselves, and not only raise the concern, but now how do we move forward, right? We identify the concern. Now how do we move forward? And sometimes that takes time. And for those raising those concerns, as constituents, I would say sometimes you have to exercise a little patience for the process. If you're a Philadelphia 76ers fan, you remember the process, right? Where it was a rebuilding program. And so sometimes we have to be patient through the process, and we may not see or we may not feel that immediate response of work. But over due time, and we keep working at it, keep chipping away, we'll get there. Again, going back to, we used to always, what's the saying? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? In the SWAT world, we would say, how do you clear a 500,000 square foot building? One room at a time. And so we just have to remember to be patient as we work through it.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean you're an Eagles fan as well, Brandon? I think I knew that answer.
100%. Fly.
I knew it. So, hey, Jonathan, so going back to Brandon's point about having conversations, right? And that's critical. That's a big part of what we do with ZeroNow is have conversations. Let's get people and exchanging ideas. So, Jonathan, you as a policymaker, how do you address concerns of all the different stakeholders that you have in your community, ranging from students, parents, teachers, administrators, other elected officials? How do you address all the different concerns and come up with a plan?
Well, I'd like to first of all point out that, let's have some moderation, Jeff Kelly, with the Celtics talk. So, Mary, if you watch him, you might have to ban him. I'm still a little bitter. It's been tough. Eagles, Phillies, now Sixers. So when it comes down to all of this information, and I saw some question in chat about, right, how do you convey? You could say something, but what do you do to empower people? Well, it's most important. I've already talked about how many receptors are up, right? How responsive are you personally to emails and calls? Brandon made a great point. There are times that I might not agree with someone's perception. I may have a different opinion, but every single parent or student or community member that has concerns about school safety, that is impassioned and brings that issue up, you better listen and cut through any of your perceptions, because there could be truth in there and something that you need to work on. So you've got to be humble. And what's this all about? Relationships. So it's, we're sixth largest school district in PA, but some in California, Texas, Florida can laugh at us, right? That's 13,000 students. Okay. But for us, that's a lot. 100,000 constituents, 9 volunteer unpaid school board members with no staff whatsoever. So command and control for this really chain of command, span of control, to any school board director out there, reach out to me. If you don't have a strong system in place and structure for your governance, And right, your board is your board of directors is your air traffic control tower. Your superintendent is the pilot of the plane. Don't get in the weeds. But what are you doing to know your role? That's important. So now I'll get a bit out of the weeds and explaining that first. That digression for school board directors. It goes back to 2008 study, and that's one of the ones I was thinking of in the beginning, prior knowledge to potential school-based violence. This was the Department of Ed and Secret Service study, relationships in safer environments. That is see something, say something. We'll get you this research, whoever was asking for it, that's going to present something to the administrator if you look in the chat. Thank you, Mary. But it's really simple, common sense for most of us. But this study was able to prove, and though it was 2008, it goes to today. If schools have a climate in which people feel, students, that they can report something and there's a responsiveness and an action, even if they don't know what the outcome is, that is going to reduce the risk of a violent incident in a school setting. And the research shows common sense, but it proves it. Those schools in which students did not feel a connection, this is K-12 and higher education, at those schools, there's an increased risk, and they were able to prove they weren't able to avert school violence. And so that's really important. Relationships, that doesn't cost a lot of money. There may be training and everything else involved. I guess beyond that, what tools are you actually putting into people's hands and then resonating frequently so that they understand? If it's the Safe to Say Something anonymous tip program, do you have stickers on buses? What promotions are there? At our high school has its own TV program every morning, commercials there. What are you doing with an extensive PR program for every layer of your security and the opportunities for people to know what's out there and how to use it? Often a school district will invest in some great technology or program. People won't know about it 90 days later. So feel it's our job as school board directors, that's our oversight fiduciary, to make sure that we're getting our money's worth, but then that the program, because it relates to strategy, is being used effectively. So you have to evaluate things. What gets measured matters. That's my last point. If you don't have a line item in your budget, something needs to change, because budgets show priorities.
And relationships, man, that's a very important point. It's all about relationships, interpersonal relationships. Mr. Harden.
I was going to say something else, but Jonathan's right. Budgets do show priorities. And oftentimes, what I found out in the municipal budget is when you set master plans for the capital work that you might want to do in the next 10 years or 20 years on sewer or on water, if it's in the master plan, doesn't mean it's necessarily going to get done. You may never find the money for it. But if it's not in the master plan, you absolutely will not ever on the docket. Two of them are stuck in committee and will likely not get a vote. And the third has been voted on by the House, but has had 3 readings in the Senate and has not gone up for a vote yet. And so if you were building relationships in the Oregon Senate right now, and that was a bill that was important to you, it could be your testimony that tips the scale, that makes them decide, yes, we've heard enough, we need to bring this to a vote.
Yeah, sorry about that. I got my computer completely just shut down and restarted once again. So hopefully we'll make it through this. So Scott, just we're talking about budget and funding, and I believe you mentioned once that you had your area schools had a bond measure passed to receive federal and state grants to harden your school campuses. Is that the best way to address school safety, is through hardening the campus, or are there other options that we should be considering?
Sure. Well, the bond measure is supposed to be in grants. It was actually tax dollars from the residents. It added to their property tax dollars. And so, to the credit of 52% of the people that showed up to vote, they viewed school safety as worth the money. And so that's the other thing I would do. I escrow my taxes in my mortgage. And so there have been years in the last 16 or so where I haven't read my property tax statement. And I would tell you to read your property tax statement, because if you're upset about the money that you're paying for schools and you don't actually know what you're paying for schools, you should. and quite frankly, you may not be as mad because chances are we're not spending enough. But at any rate, like I say, that bond measure barely passed, despite the likelihood of passage related to safety being 72%. It passed at 52. And so, and sometimes when there are other bond measures on a ballot, people do go bond shopping. They can't afford to spend all of the money, but they want to focus, some of the spending on one thing that they feel like they can vote yes on. And, just sometimes getting them to say yes is about how you manage a campaign. So I'm of a mind that if you want people to vote for you, you need to ask them. And so in 100 days, I canvassed 1,000 doors by myself. And the communications director from the school district did about 1,000 doors. And I think you need, so you got to go out and ask people to vote for those bond measures. And you have to be creative. So what the communications director found was that while the school can't do advocacy work, the Oregon Secretary of State, for free, would scrub any communications that they wanted to do of what might be considered as advocacy and just keep the facts in there. So the district took part in promoting the bond as well by having banners at all the schools talking about what the money would buy, by having stories in all of the school newsletters talking about what the money would buy. And, we got, despite a history of bond measures not passing where I live, we got teachers out to volunteer because they want to be safe too. It's not just the students that are in our classrooms or the students that are receiving threats. It's our teachers, our teachers' aides, our janitors, the school secretary. They all want to work in a safe environment too. So you got to convince them to be part of the messaging as well.
So, go ahead, Brandon.
One of the other components I was gonna add is, to some degree, right, there's a little bit of safety in numbers. And so when you have, going back to, my point about, community folks gathering and having those conversations, folks that are in my role and the roles of the folks that are on this webinar, right? Whether it be at your county level, at your state level, are you getting together as professionals in the field and having those conversations across the county or across the state, and then taking those concerns from those conversations to that next level, right? Because sometimes it's, it could be perceived as the one-off here, the one-off here, the one-off there, because maybe there's only one or two people having those conversations. But much like my thoughts about the community coming together and having those conversations, right? Those that are in the roles of leaders, whether it be superintendents, school boards, school safety directors. I know both where I work and where I serve on the school board in two different counties, we meet as county folks in school safety across the board to talk about what's happening across the county in the different districts and who's having this issue and finding success at that and taking that, right, borrowing that information and using it and then using that leverage to go to the next level, kind of as one mega voice, right, one choir to those elected officials at the next level or leaders at the next level to voice those concerns and talk about some pathways to address those issues. So another resource, right, is the thought leaders gathering together from across, whether it be multiple school districts in one county, or maybe it's one school district in one county, and taking all of the like-minded leadership thought to the next level. And so it's just another resource.
Definitely. As far as resources, I just want to give folks a heads up. So this webinar and other conversations that we've had, other sessions, will be available in a website we'll be releasing in August called The Path to Zero, that provides school administrators with an actionable path forward to get to zero harm in their schools and their campuses. And so on that note, Jonathan, we both Scott and Brandon, and you also mentioned this about having these conversations and getting the right people to the table and collaborating. So what advice would you give to a school administrator? What is the best forum? Is it holding a school safety town hall meeting, inviting the entire community? Is it one-on-one meetings? Is it just a series of discussions? What would you recommend is the best way to have these conversations in a way that captures input from all the different stakeholders?
Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I'll defer to you, Brandon, please. I'm learning more from you.
I think there's a multi-layered approach there, right? And so you have to think about, if we go back to some of the basics, there are some people in school organizations that are responsible for leadership or for school safety that really don't have a background in that, have no experience in that, right? And so now, because their state has a mandate that says you have to have a coordinator responsible for safety, we're taking a curriculum director or a facilities director, and it's not that they can't learn it, but they're being thrown into this role with all these expectations and don't have the training, the background, or the experience. And so now they're trying to figure out their way around this massive undertaking that they were thrown into, and try to keep up with all the evolutions that are happening, right? And it's different for those who have a coordinator with experience in public safety, who can bring that expertise, and so that the educator can worry about education and use that resource who has expertise in school safety, so that they can focus on the school safety and the educators can focus on the education. And so there's that piece of, I don't know what I don't know, right? But now it's ultimately on me to try to figure it out. And so sometimes, again, going back to those relationships, you might have to pick up the phone and call somebody from a neighboring district to say, hey, this school safety is not my thing. I'm struggling here. How can you help me? This is what we're facing. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to meet these demands and requirements. How do I get there, right? And so again, going back to that uncomfortable conversation to some degree, to ask those questions, to put you on a path to help you navigate this water as you're learning what this water really is all about. And again, for those who do have the experience and the expertise and the training in it, continue to be true and committed to safety, right? And not checking the box or doing something just to say we did it, but are we doing this to fidelity for the best interests of the students, right? Are we doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do? And that's always so crucial with any decision making, especially when we're talking about folks' safety that we are ultimately responsible for. And so it's very, very crucial that we just have the courageous conversation and know our role and figure out ways to push forward with what is best for ultimately the students and the staff of your community.
Great thoughts, Jonathan.
The one aspect that, as usual, I learned a lot, Brandon, that I was writing down there, so I got to follow up with you. There's that aspect of trust your vendors. If you've got a good vendor, that they hire people who have decades of experience and expertise. Don't ignore that. This isn't 20th century anymore. We think you're just being upsold. We don't have to tell the people who are here on this webinar, you get it. But how can you prove to those who make the decisions? How can you speak to the C-suite or the CFO so they understand the proper return on investment, especially when austerity is coming? And the sad thing is, even school safety and security is looking at cuts. So we have to position ourselves so that your board of directors who make the decisions hear, because they aren't experts, why this matters. So you're doing an internal sales job as well. That's where the evidence-based standards, the other types of practices and research that you can bring to the table. the fact that you have vendors who are willing to help, and these are committed people, that matters. And I really see that going forward, there are the state police and other agencies who can do assessments, and those are great. Have that as part of your strategy. For us, it takes years sometimes to get into the queue. It's very important. I see a real expansion in using independent objective consultants, and which are some great ones nationwide, because school districts can't add the head count and they can't add the expertise, especially when it's being pushed down to building levels. Everyone knows those who know me know that in my career, I come from the Clery Act and the federal mandate dealing with safety and security and crime data in higher education. And that's where many breakdowns occur. They'll, 50% FTE, you're now Clery compliance coordinator. And that's where a college or university fails. That's what's going to happen if we aren't smart about how we spend our resources, almost like an insurance policy. If you spend the money on these resources, we're going to get a lot more out of it faster, further than simply trying to use the internal resources all the time.
Definitely. Scott, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, my thought was a little bit more back to something that Brandon said about you might have to get a big crowd together. And then in the chat, there's an alter. Most politicians are driven to action when they have something to gain or something to lose. And, I was the mayor of a city of only about 4,200 people. There weren't many contentious issues. I think I was only involved in 10 votes that weren't unanimous. And my only disappointment was that I had a losing record. But I would often poll counselors one-on-one. You don't want to violate public meeting laws, about where they stood on an issue that was going to be on our agenda, particularly if I thought we were going to have a crowd. And I could have a really good feeling going in, and I could watch their decision change in real time because they were intimidated by the size of the crowd, or they were doing the election calculus out of 4,000 people. If this many show up, if I don't do it their way, what's the likelihood of my being reelected? And also I could see their minds change in real time because the people legitimately changed their mind. That they came to the realization that the citizens had a better idea. And so the big crowd makes it happen. You will add not only knowledge but courage to your electeds when you show up in a big crowd.
Yeah, no doubt. I just wanted to comment. Somebody posted in there, Richard and Jeff Kelly, bunch of folks. Yeah, the ZeroNow community. It's first and foremost a community to have conversations, and folks like Jeff Kelly and and other folks in the community are here to be a resource for you as a school official, administrator. All important. And this whole forum is about connecting with one another, sharing our experiences, best practices, connecting you with resources that can help you get to zero harm. So let me, we have time for maybe just one more question here. Let's see here. So Jonathan, let's go back to the whole point about, like tracking incidents, like making decisions based on actual data, and how can the public trust data that's reported about criminal activity or incidents? How do you establish that trust? Because it can vary from place to place. Is that correct?
Yeah, I feel like kind of end where you begin where you end. We have to ask the questions whether you are in the administration or you're leading the security team. How accurate is your data? How often is it being reviewed? How can it be utilized to track trends and patterns that inform how you allocate resources, right? Once again, you're only getting better return on investment for taxpayer dollars anyway. Sadly, in K-12 in particular, and higher ed has been trying to deal with this for decades now with the Clery Act.
Right.
If you're a school board director, you should understand the data, not in the weeds at a granular level, but are you getting good information that can inform your decisions strategically? Because that's going to be another data point to understand perception, reality, all the diverse opinions and challenges that are being brought to you that deal with school safety and security, which ultimately you can't educate a student if they feel they're unsafe. And so it all comes back to data as that baseline. As I mentioned, many states, there are really no teeth in the law. You know why Florida has teeth in the law now if a school doesn't report properly? It's unfortunately because of Parkland. In our state of Pennsylvania and many nationwide, the Department of Public Education, there's absolutely no problem if you don't report accurately. And if you're looking at your data only once a year, you're not looking at data. You're looking at the past. And so I just really want to make sure, I think that the innovators are going to find ways to track the data on a daily, monthly, quarterly basis and not just look at it annually. And if you're doing that, it's going to make everything else click into place with how you communicate internally and externally with your stakeholders.
No, makes total sense, Jonathan. All right, we have run out of time. So before we wrap things up, I just would like each of you just to share one final thought, word of wisdom from our participants. An experience, keep it brief. Scott, we'll start with you.
Perception. We started the meeting with that, and Jonathan has talked at length about evidence-based and data, and you would be scared to know how often that's ignored and that your elected officials govern based on perception. So somebody in the chat said, when have the panelists ever not gotten something that they wanted? Well, I wanted some land that was zoned only for single family housing to be zoned to put in a 163 unit apartment complex. And some of our council and some of the people testifying said, well, that would overwhelm our schools, that the potential for that many more children in the city. Well, in Oregon, property tax is the second highest funder for schools. The highest is the Oregon School Fund, and you get money from the Oregon School Fund based on how many students you have. And the schools are begging for students. They would love to see every apartment building built. And so, it may be you that has to know the data and that has to know the evidence-based things, and you bring it up to the politicians. Don't count on them knowing it. And don't count on them being willing to vote that way just because the evidence says they should.
Thank you, Scott. Mr. Rohn, your final thoughts, words of wisdom for our folks.
Sure. I always appreciate the opportunity to have conversation with passionate folks, like-minded folks who want to make sure our schools across the nation are safe. And I use this opportunity just as a panelist, but also as a spectator, right? To learn from others, the conversations that are happening in the chats, things that, sometimes if you don't have an opportunity to broaden out and go across the country, you think your issue is only your issue. And then you get to talking to folks and you realize that some folks are dealing with the same things, at all four corners of the country. And so I always appreciate the opportunity, but what I'll leave you with this, stay the course. This work is not easy. If it was easy, everybody will be doing it. And so always position, stand on your position because it's the right thing to do, whether it's politically correct or not. If it's the right thing to do, stand on that position and continue to march on and keep pushing for safety, because it's paramount to everybody, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, when the time to perform has come, the time to prepare has passed. And so we always have to be prepared as we don't know what's going to knock on our door. Thanks you, everybody.
Thanks, Brandon. And Jonathan Casa, final thoughts.
School safety isn't about gotcha. If you should have a culture internally that people can talk about mistakes, identify gaps, know your blind spots. For the elected officials who have that oversight, you really have to create a culture of trust. Otherwise, you don't have a chance of ever getting a more full picture of what people's perceptions and realities are about safety. So stay humble.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Just to wrap things up here, appreciate all of your insights, and really some of the things I took away is, number one, bring together all stakeholders, have conversations, be proactive, right? That's all critical things. So I want to remind folks, our next next discussion is on Tuesday, June 20th. We're going to be discussing empowering educators, educating future teachers on school security and violence prevention. There's a program that's being run in Indian River Community College that we want to share with you about getting teachers prepared for the worst case scenario, and hopefully they don't have to deal with that, obviously. But once again, we could continue this conversation for another hour, but you can. The good news is you can in the ZeroNow community. There's a chat after this with any questions you want to ask our panelists. They'll be in here. We'll have the replay of this available within the next week, but keep the conversation going. It's all about conversations, sharing ideas, sharing experiences like you all mentioned, and have a good rest of the day and be safe. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Take care.